A very good morning and welcome back to day 2 of the 16th Khazanah Megatrends Forum with the theme, The Invention of Tomorrow, Crafting Our New Collective Narrative. For our first course session today on Firms and Transformation, themed Trials and Tribulations in Sustainability, How Do We Create Real Impact? Let's invite our chair, Sharifidin Mohamed, Head of Strategy, Khazanah, and he'll be joined by Luanne, Sieh, Senior Managing Director and Head Group Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility, CIMB Group, Rohaya Yusof, Chief Investment Officer, Employees Provident Fund, EPF, Tanah Sullivan, Head of Sustainability, GoTo Group, and Tariq, former Chief Investment Officer for Sustainable Investing, BlackRock, and founder of the Rumi Initiative. Please welcome our panel speakers. Over to you, Dino.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of KMF. We've had quite an engaging and thought-provoking day 1, and I hope to continue in a similar vein with this morning's session on one of the most pertinent topics of today, sustainability and ESG. Yesterday, many of the speakers touched on this subject, and in particular on climate change, the most pressing and existential challenge that we as humanity are facing today. From Tengku Taufik's sharing of Petronas' planned transition from an oil and gas company into a progressive energy and solutions partner, to Andrew Ang's comment that sustainable investing is the invention of tomorrow, and that if we don't solve for the S and the G, we will fail with the E. ESG came out as a consistent and key theme throughout. Today's session, we will cover sustainability from the perspective of firms. I don't have to remind everyone how much capital flows have shifted towards ESG, especially in recent years, and that companies are now expected by their investors, board, customers, and employees to behave responsibly and embrace sustainability. However, doing so sometimes comes at a cost, and often we have to consider how can we justify a green premium or accept some of the trade-offs to profits or returns while making this shift. Today, I would like to welcome 4 esteemed panelists who we are privileged to have with us today. Rohaya Yusof, Chief Investment Officer of EPF, Luanne, Sieh, Head of Group Sustainability at CIMB Group, Tanah Sullivan, Head of Sustainability at GoTo Group, and Tariq, Founder of Rumi Initiative and former CIO of Sustainable Investing at BlackRock. Before I go to my panelists, I would like to start with an assertion which I hope will frame the upcoming discussion. While ESG is an accepted part of investments and is being embedded into core strategies of many firms, some will argue that ESG frameworks do not necessarily lead to impact. Furthermore, some will say that it detracts from structural changes in policy and regulations that are required to fix big issues such as greenhouse gas emissions. So how can we, either as operating companies or as investment managers, pivot towards an approach that creates real impact, driving systemic change in our global investments and business ecosystems? So I'll start with Rohaya. Among the GLICs, EPF has been at the forefront of championing sustainability as a core part of your investment strategy. EPF was among the first institutions to announce your climate aspirations, a net zero 2050 target, and openly sharing views on ESG integration. EPF has also followed through on specific issues, voting through and also divesting on companies that are facing ESG issues. So can you share a bit about how EPF looks at sustainability and perhaps touch on the fund's views on specific issues like climate change and members' retirement savings?
So thank you, Nick, and a very good morning to everyone. Very happy to be here this morning. So let me just go through a little bit of our history. We set up as an ethical fund those days. So it's based on negative screening. So for example, alcohol, weapon, gambling, and all that has been excluded in our investment. In 2019, we became a signatory to the UN standards. And from there on, late last year, we published our ESG sustainable framework and policies. So this year, what we're doing today is we are coming up, drafting out a sector policy and issue policy. So sector policy is identifying 6 key sectors that we think are ESG risk sector. For example, oil and gas, utilities, construction, or plantation, financial. So those are sectors that we are currently now drafting out sector policies, putting in minimum standards. And at the same time, we are also addressing two key issues, which is climate change and labor rights, or labor well-being, well-being. So these are things that we are currently in progress and doing. But at the same time, we are collaborating a lot with the IIC, Institutional Investor Councils, to work together with all the institutions to come up with baseline standards that we could apply as part of this collaboration of pushing this sustainability agenda.
Yep. So I think that's quite an interesting one. Maybe you can elaborate more about how EPF looks at specific issues, for example, around climate, and also you would like to share a bit about how the members' savings in lieu of the COVID pandemic that we faced last year. How has that shaped out over the last 12 to 24 months?
So climate issues is again, investors are exposed to climate risk issues, and through a portfolio they manage and invest in. So this among the risks is obviously, is stranded assets, resulting in this transition to lower carbon economy. So some of the basically, common climate change issues are, for example, GHG emission, air pollution, energy management, waste management. So those are the key areas that we are trying to address across sector. And for workers' well-being, we're looking at forced labor issues, health and safety, diversity, remuneration. So again, across all sectors. So as you know that we are a social security, so we acknowledge importance of workers' well-being and issues surrounding, which includes, again, forced labor or child labor. So that's an important and key element for us. So just give you some perspective with regards to social aspect. COVID-19, as you know, that has brought some social issues in the spotlight. I think for us, as you know, that last year, we introduced 3 huge initiatives or withdrawal initiative, which is Lestari, Sinar, and Chitra. So that total withdrawal had impact of close to about 100 billion withdrawals from their savings account. So that's very concerning, because number one is that if you look at our member profile, today our members, we have about 15 million members. So about 7.6 million are active members. So pre-COVID, we've been highlighting issues regarding adequacy of savings. So in our statistics, about 21 members will meet the basic saving. Only 21% of members will meet basic saving. But post pandemic or currently today, it has gone down to 18%. So by end of the year, I think we expect to see about 83% of our members likely to have problems of fulfilling their basic savings. So, and again, probably I just give you some statistics on the withdrawal. So our members, which is the critical low savings, which is saying that near zero, is about 3.6 million of them having near zero savings. And less than 10,000 is about 6.1 million. So that's a big number of population of our members that has depleted their savings. So most of them would be actually the B40. So they have basically about 40% of their savings has been reduced. So this is a very serious retirement crisis that we are facing today. So again, these are something that I think even ourselves and probably working together with government should see to address, basically adequacy of savings of our members.
So it is quite worrying when you share the numbers, and I think collectively, corporate Malaysia, all the employers of these employees that have withdrawn a lot of the savings, probably need to look at how we can build it back over the next few years, so that when these employees do retire, they would have that retirement, so that they can retire adequately. So moving on to Luanne. I think two questions for you. I think CIMB is a leading bank in Malaysia, and it's one of the first that came up with this sustainable strategy. And with your presence across several markets in ASEAN, maybe you can share, touch on what has gone well in the journey and what have been some of the challenges. And also, second question for you is that CIMB has played an instrumental role at initiating sustainability conversations among Malaysian companies, both through the Cooler Earth Summit as well as the action-focused platform of CEO Action Network. So maybe you can also touch on that and also share your views of whether that has been an effective platform towards leading to outcomes that matter. Over to you, Luanne.
Thank you, Dino. I've got some slides. If you could share the slides, please. Thank you. So I think before we talk about, what are the challenges and how well it's gone or not, I think the first thing is why we are doing this. If we go back to the first slide, please. So why are we doing sustainability, and why is sustainability important to CIMB? The very first thing is that at the core of it, it aligns with our values and our purpose. Next slide. Yeah. And our purpose really is to help to advance customers in society. Secondly, it's very important to our business. It is not just a competitive advantage where we have access to new clients, new business segments, but also, as Rohaya said, there's a huge risk element as well, where we have potential for stranded assets. Our loan to values may be impacted by things like floods on our mortgage book, etc. So there is a very, very strong business case to do this. Now, thirdly, it is also our responsibility. So as a financial service player, yes, we have our own footprints, but our main influence is really through our clients. First of all, we are, as providers of capital, we can influence where money goes. And if it goes to an area that supports sustainable development, or if it goes to an area, for example, that is actually creating negative impacts on the environment and on society. So we've got safeguards around those. And finally, is our stakeholders. I think when we first started, and in fact, this was our very first trigger to start sustainability. And this was the conversation back in 2018, where some of the global investors were asking us difficult questions about what we're doing with some of the environmentally sensitive sectors, and not just the investors, but we also spoke to our employees who were highly supportive, and also customers, especially the millennials, who are more and more so looking at doing business with responsible companies. So coming back to why it's important, we do all these things, but very importantly, it is really just doing the right thing. And when people ask us, does your policy have loopholes? How does this work? We always come back to, it's not what we say on paper, but really, why are we doing this? And it's why we are trying to do the right thing. Okay, next slide, please. Now, we did this pretty gradually. So I think with many companies, we started with our philanthropic activities, but we really started in earnest in 2018 when we joined UNEP FI and started formulating our strategy and set up the unit. And then we put in the fundamentals on the risk side, and then we started looking at the business side. And finally this year, actually just about 2 weeks ago, we announced our deepened commitments on net zero, on a number on sustainable finance, as well as a number on community investments. So it's a gradual journey, and all companies need to kind of do it, I guess, in a reasonable and staged way, but not in a way that is too slow that, you know, by the time you get anything done, it's 2050. Next slide, please. This is how we look at sustainability at CMB. It's always two perspectives. One is, how do we reduce our negative impacts? It could be our direct operations, like our energy, our carbon footprint, what we do with suppliers, and what we do with our clients. But it's also reducing the negative impact is not good enough. We need to also figure out how we increase the positive impact. So how do we help our suppliers become more sustainable? How do we help our clients? How do we promote diversity and inclusion in our workforce, for example? Next slide. Now, coming to the negative impact, and you were asking about how do we create real impact, right? So this is an example of some of the factors that we look at when we assess our corporate and commercial banking clients, and we do this for all high-risk sector clients. And these are some of, on the left, some of the factors that we look at when we assess cases. And what is the impact, you might ask? On the right-hand side, you can see some stats. Out of all the cases we've assessed, about 1% have not been recommended to proceed, i.e. we walk away. 12% of the cases, we have recommended time-bound action plans. So we agree an action plan for the client to close within a certain date. And to date, out of that 12%, 80% of those cases have met have achieved their action plans. So that is some of the examples of the impacts that we create on the negative or reducing negative impacts. Next slide. This is how we look at positive impact. So what do we do through our products? How do we facilitate, transition to a low carbon economy? How do we help, for example, the B40 and other vulnerable segments? And how do we educate and uplift our clients to do, and our communities as well, to become more sustainable? Next slide. Now, these are some of the focus areas that we're looking at, but these are just examples. So they're across green, social, and sustainable. Sustainable meaning green plus social. And we're really anchored by this it's kind of like an internal taxonomy where, we use this together with the Bank Negara climate change principle-based taxonomy to identify which are the areas we want to focus on. And we also have sector limits for some of the less environmentally friendly sectors. Next. Now, very importantly, you asked about collaboration and stakeholders. So you mentioned that we have the Cooler Earth, and we do that. This is the third year. It's a conference that we have. Actually, it's free for all our customers, community, anybody. One of the things that we are very big on is collaboration with global parties and groups, working groups. So for example, we're part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and that's part of the Net Zero, one of the Net Zero coalitions. We're an official supporter of TCFD. And why do we do this, right? It's because, it's looking at each other. So we always have this conversation about how do we get better in sustainable finance? Well, we need to have those connections to the global working groups, to the thought leaders, because this area is changing so quickly. And this is really one of the challenges where, looking at each other, it doesn't really help. We need to figure out how to do very difficult things like scoping out our Scope 3 emissions for financial services. We need to do this in a group, collaboratively. And that's what we do, for example, with the Net Zero Banking Alliance and with PCAF as well, who have a lot of data that we need. Locally, we're working very closely with the Joint Committee on Climate Change, which is co-chaired by BNM and SC. And we're also part of the CEO Action Network, which we kind of threw out the idea, and now we've got more than 50 CEOs on board, which is really great. Next slide. So just a couple of things on CEO Action Network, and I'm talking about this because I would like as many companies as possible to join. Actually, both Khazanah and EPF are also on the CEO Action Network. There are three key things we look at. First thing is, how do we increase our own sustainability performance of our members? Secondly is, how do we advocate for governments, policy change, etc. Third thing is, how do we build capacity in our ecosystems and in our own companies as well? And we have recently announced, next slide, a set of collective commitments that all our members will sign up to and achieve by 2023. They're at 3 levels. So we've got level 1, which is the basic things, up to level 3, which includes net zero commitments, and they're across all 3 pillars. So what we realized is, we really, there is no such thing as a single hero in sustainability. We need to do it with other companies, with other people, and we need to do it collaboratively. Next slide. And this is what CAN is about. Happy to take questions or discussions later on. Thank you.
So thanks, Luanne. So maybe just asking a question around the CEO Action Network. So among the 50 companies, we all come from different ends of the ESG adoption spectrum, right? So you have companies that have been looking at it for many years, some of the multinationals who are based in Malaysia, and also some companies that are just embarking on their own respective ESG journeys. So how do we manage the different starting points of all the different firms towards, getting corporate Malaysia to embrace this ESG and sustainability? What are your views?
So by putting down these collective commitments, we're actually saying to all our members that, no matter what your starting point is, there are things that you can do and you should do. And it is very clear that this is an action-oriented network. So no matter where you are, you need to improve. And the beauty of actually having multiple industries is really the collaboration. The beauty of having people at different levels or companies at different maturity levels is that they can help each other. And peer learning and support is really one of the key kind of benefits of the CEO Action Network.
Okay, thank you. So I think from EPF and CIMB, we've seen that where money goes or where money flows, do contribute to influencing the broader capital markets or corporate Malaysia towards some sustainability outcomes. So moving on, I think what we'll do is I'll go to Tanah next. Tanah, you've been looking at sustainability, but before that, you've been looking at sustainability from a public sector and policy perspective. Now that you're at GoTo, one of the largest technology groups in Southeast Asia, can you share a bit about how GoTo looks at sustainability from your ecosystem of large ecosystem of drivers and delivery riders to all the products supplied through your e-commerce platforms, and finally from your own corporate center activities? So maybe you can share some of your views on sustainability.
Sure, thanks, Dino. So, gosh, when you put it that way, it does make it sound like a very daunting job I have. But lucky for me, it's not just me on my own, right? It's the entire organization, the entire group, every operational company that's within GoTo Group, which encompasses, as you mentioned, it's Gojek, GoTo Financial, and Tokopedia. It is not at all a responsibility we take lightly. We're a relatively young company in terms of our corporate life cycle. We don't necessarily have the same coffers as other companies who are more established, who have been around a lot longer than us. But we are led by, if I can say so, a relatively young, because we're all the same age cohort, similar age cohorts, a relatively young group of leaders who are incredibly mission-driven. And I know this term gets thrown around a lot, but before I came into the GoTo Group family, I was a little cautious of it, but truly this is a group of mission-driven, purpose-driven leaders. And you can tell by the way that companies like Tokopedia or Gojek were founded. They were founded in a country, Indonesia, where problem solving is in the country's, in the citizens' kind of DNA. And it's incredibly innovative, and there's so many problems here that require quite complex problem solving, and Gojek and Tokopedia having that kind of spirit within their own company's DNAs, it really kind of demonstrates what kind of company we are now as one group. And so in saying that, the way that we approach sustainability look, it is a whole of group effort. We are kind of navigating pretty murky waters if you look at it, right? Because we're not necessarily from an established industry per se, the nature of the industries where we operate or the market where we operate in, the markets where we operate in, it's not so clear cut for us what sustainability or ESG looks like. Where does our scope of accountability or responsibility start and end? Of course, saying what I was going back to what I was saying before around being mission driven and so forth. Yeah, we were, the companies were conceived with the mission of giving agency and economic access and opportunities to groups of this country, Indonesia, who largely had no economic voice, had no agency, who weren't part of the formal economy before. And if you look at it very, very kind of black and white, we kind of did that already. But that said, how do we do better from where we were before to where we are now? How do we integrate kind of what's considered best practice and what international standards there are out there? How can we apply those to our business now to ensure that our future business plans and growth are very much in line with what the outside world considers best practice? And I say it that way because, again, these are relatively murky waters that we're navigating. It's again, not very, very clear cut. You look at any of the acronyms out there, whether you're looking at GRI or SASB and others, and yeah, they were designed to serve specific stakeholder groups. I don't think personally that we are one of them because we are a technology company, we're a platform company, we cut across all these different industries. But what I and many other leaders across GoTo Group really try and do is making sure that in our business decision-making process internally is that we have the right environmental and social considerations as part of that decision-making process. And what do I mean by that? With every product we come out with every new feature or new service or new program for our drivers or our merchants or our millions of sellers across this country and across the region, we have to make sure that embedded in that decision-making process, we are considering what is the environmental impact of these products, services, programs? What is the social impact on our drivers, merchants, sellers, and other stakeholder groups we consider? And making sure that that's really built in before we do anything. And it's not just me as a sustainability head, but really a collective effort across the entire leadership team. This is a pre-competitive space, so we're continuously learning from others. But we also know that Indonesia and the ASEAN region broadly is a very unique market. And as such, we have very unique challenges. And it's not necessary that we can just copy and paste solutions from more advanced, or what's worked in more advanced markets. And so all these different layers we're trying to navigate at the same time, supporting government as they're themselves navigating the right regulatory policies as it relates to the environment, as it relates to responding and preparing for climate change, as it relates to addressing the social inequalities and wealth disparities here in this country and across this region. I'd exclude Singapore from that, of course, but these are additional layers of complexity that we are also trying to define our role in and what we can do and how we can best support the government and how we can best support the very, very important stakeholders in our ecosystem, which go beyond just our shareholders. Because remembering also, we're still a company at heart, and we're doing what a company is supposed to do. We've taken money from investors, which means we have a duty to our shareholders, but it's not just about them anymore. And so I think trying to now embed all these other stakeholder groups' perspectives equally, if not more, than what our investors are telling us is again another complex challenge. But we are, I think, slowly getting through there. It's a grinding process. My job is equally part strategist as it is diplomat and negotiator, and I mean that both internally and externally. But I'm very, very confident. We're on the right track. We're learning as fast as we can. And we are reaching out to all the partners, not just within our ecosystem, but outside of it to make sure that this is not just a piecemeal effort, but rather a whole ecosystem-wide approach.
Okay. So from GoTo's perspective, right, you have a wide, as you describe it, layers of ecosystem, including the delivery riders, merchants, and so on. So How did the COVID-19 pandemic affect, some of the stakeholders, the communities that, Gojek operated in? And also the delivery riders that, fall under the umbrella. How was that impact? How were they impacted? And, is there anything that Gojek did to try and sort of support the stakeholders during this challenging time?
So, look, for a lot of the platform companies out there, COVID affected us incredibly, right? We can't create demand, and there were very quick efforts that were implemented on the Gojek side of things, specifically for the driver partners, to ensure that they were safe. Because, unfortunately, for a lot of them, well, fortunately and unfortunately, for a lot of them, their primary source of income, their livelihood is from the Gojek platform, which means that they don't have a choice but to be out there every day. Unlike a lot of us who are privileged and have the luxury of being able to work from home, a lot of our driver partners do not have that option or that luxury. And so for us, it was ensuring that we had the right health and safety mechanisms put in place to protect our drivers, to then also protect riders who are still going out as well, our users. And we did that with a lot of, I won't go through the details, but there's things like, for example, every week we were disinfecting vehicles. It was all at Gojek's cost, of course, checking our drivers. We've run vaccination programs for our driver partners, and to ensure that, we could support also the government's target of getting vaccines out there. And making sure that that we were as a gateway for government financial and social protection schemes for our driver partners, and then also for our merchants as well, because we also do have merchants and sellers on our platform. I haven't talked a lot about this, but we do, look, I think we have kind of set pretty ambitious targets, like many other companies. These include net zero targets of our own. We call them the 3 0 commitments: zero emissions, zero waste, and zero barriers. And I think zero emissions and zero waste is pretty self-explanatory for us. It's really about how we reduce the negative environmental impact of our ecosystem, not just our company, but our ecosystem, with the millions of users and merchants and partners and sellers that are on it. But the third one, which you touched upon, Dino, really is related to zero barriers. And this is probably the most complex of all, but we want to make sure that our drivers, our partners, our merchants are as resilient as possible to future shocks like COVID. And we consider climate change very much one of those. It's not an if, but a when, right? We all know this. And so we're trying to take action now to make sure that when extreme temperatures, because by the way, Indonesia is an incredibly vulnerable country to climate-related risks, climate change. And so for us, it's how do we protect our drivers? How do we protect our merchants to ensure that they can continue to earn sustainable income, for the long term, that our platform can exist in the long term. Yep. And there's minimal disruption to our operations because, by the way, flooding happens constantly in a city like Jakarta. I'm sure all of you are aware it's one of the most vulnerable cities. It's sinking on its current trajectory. 96% of North Jakarta will be underwater by 2050. What happens to all the people who are there who don't necessarily have the financial capacity or luxury of being able to just move? So I think, these are incredibly complex challenges that it goes beyond our company at this point in time. It goes really to how we, with the ecosystem that we have, with the reach we have, with the technology we have, how can we support the government in being able to do this? And this maybe ties back very much, I'm a little bit biased. It goes back to my policymaking days, but that's really why, I really believe that supporting and strengthening public institutions in a country like Indonesia is incredibly important. And that is kind of our main responsibility because the government serves the people. And we are still a company, and we want to make sure we're providing a return for our shareholders, but also that we're creating value alongside these partners like government, who to us are the main players on this stage. And if you look at the COVID response, what we did as GoTo Group was support the government's programs, the government's efforts to protect and roll out vaccines and protect its citizens, who to us make up our entire ecosystem.
Thanks for sharing. I think you made it quite real in terms of the impact of things like climate change, where saying that Jakarta is sinking. I used to work there for a few months, and basically the thought really scares me. The traffic's already bad as it is. So moving on to Tariq. So you've seen and done it all in your career in investments. Leading sustainable investing at BlackRock. And as mentioned earlier, and as you all know, there's been significant shifts in the capital markets, capital flows towards ESG funds, especially in recent years and this part of the world. There's also a lot of concerted efforts among corporates and investors to be action-oriented through platforms like Climate 100+. Yet you have been quite candid recently in public on whether ESG investing is really effective at tackling issues and whether it leads to outcomes that matter. Can you share your views on this? And also, building on that, what do we need to do to overcome the potential gaps in ESG investing? And how do we make effective change for the benefit of all stakeholders?
Thanks, Tino. And it's a pleasure to come after the three other panelists. I am indeed the skeptic in the room, which is not to cast aspersions on anything that anyone else said before me, or in fact, anything that my former employer, BlackRock, is doing. I've said before that I don't think it's an issue that with BlackRock or any specific company. I think we have to really zoom out and look at a systemic level. What BlackRock did do was give me the vantage point of looking at this issue at the 500-foot view of, the largest pool of assets in capitalism today. It's the largest asset manager in history, and see that what I would say is that number one, ESG unfortunately doesn't really create any real world impact. And so when I left BlackRock at the end of 2019, I made the analogy that it was like giving wheatgrass to a cancer patient. If cancer is slow moving and growing in the body like climate change is on the planet, then it's a well marketed green drink or whatever that sounds like it's a great idea, but there's no reason to believe it'll stop the cancer. And I actually went public and started arguing against it this year because I worked last year in a study. It became very clear that it's not only wheatgrass to cancer patients, it's actually delaying the public from understanding that we need government action and following expert recommendations. And in that sense, it's actually like giving wheatgrass to a cancer patient and then realizing that the cancer patient is delaying chemotherapy. And so my comments, I'll try to keep this to the next 8 or 9 minutes, really just overall what I think ESG was meant to be, what it is in practice, why I became much more skeptical about it, and I think why over the next few years we're going to see a significant change in how it's viewed in the industry, and maybe what an ESG 2.0 would need to look like. But in general, to start with, the goal of ESG is this idea that there's a win-win narrative where you can, the world is going in a direction where companies in particular who are ahead of the trends on environmental and social issues in particular will be better prepared for shifts in terms of consumer preferences, employee preferences, so on and so forth. And by getting ahead of these trends and performing well, they'll also produce better profit for their shareholders. It's very much a win-win thesis, right? Is that if you do good for the world, you'll also do well financially, and everyone benefits. And I liken it, and I released a paper just over a month ago that I think has gone spread a little bit publicly, where I analogize this to professional sports. In the paper, I use the analogy of basketball. I'm actually a soccer or football fan, but I wanted the paper to be read in the US, so I used basketball. But the idea there is that if you're, let's say, a football or soccer fan, you're on the field to score points or goals, right? I mean, that's what an athlete is there to do. And they're locked into that pursuit through, a series of structures. The financial markets would be fiduciary duty and financial incentives. And anything you do outside of that is good sportsmanship, right? It's a nice thing to do, but if you're not required to do it, you're only going to do it insofar as it doesn't take away from you winning the game, which is pretty much how the financial markets work. In most places, fiduciary duty is defined as something that means that you have to focus on dollar value, not social values, because generally speaking, it's someone else's money, and that's the sort of core of the principal agent problem that runs throughout capitalism. And so the idea then is that if it's good sportsmanship, this idea is that, by being a good sportsman, you also score better, score more points and you win more games. It's a great idea. It manifests, it's a great idea or I'd say if it were true, which I don't think it really is, but the idea is in practice means for an asset manager that you're doing two things. At a place like BlackRock, you're focusing on new products that have sort of an ESG angle, green bonds or ESG ETFs that purport to do something financially and create some kind of social impact alongside. And that's, let's say, BlackRock would be a few $100 billion of the $9.5 trillion of assets under management today. And then there's ESG integration, which is more of a process than a product. And the idea is that that process enhancement is something that you run throughout all your existing investment processes with the goal of improving returns ideally and social outcomes. And unfortunately, what I saw in my time there was that it's well-intended. So I don't cast any aspersions on anyone doing it in the industry, but the sad reality is, from a systemic level, generally speaking, accounts, it is really more marketing than anything else. If you look at the product, most of what is being sold as a sustainable product today has no demonstrable claim to creating any impact in the world that would not have otherwise occurred, right? So the majority of ESG products by dollar value are, effectively just move money around from one pocket to another. And they're based on the theory of divestment, right? The idea of divestment is the idea that, by not owning something, you maybe stop it from occurring in the world. And I know a lot of Islamic investors, for example, who won't invest alcohol companies. They do it for values alignment, but I don't think any of them think that by not owning Diageo, they're going to stop people from drinking wine in France. Unfortunately, that idea has pervaded financial markets with respect to climate change, and leads to deciding that you could divest and change oil companies' behaviors, which has never really been proven to work. And it's kind of like it's like kind of cancel culture meets financial markets. ESG ETFs are based on the same premise, right? They just tilt in a certain direction and they own a little bit less of an area. And so those green bonds and other things don't really have any real impact. The bigger problem that I saw was that ESG integration in and of itself, the idea that you can use ESG to get better returns, is also not generally true. And I'm going to read you a quote. It's in today's Financial Times, and it's around Facebook and the whistleblower that just came out in the last couple of days. This is in today's FT, or I guess yesterday's, because it's Tuesday there. Direct quote: "There were conflicts of interest between what was good for the public and what was good for Facebook," the whistleblower said in an interview. And Facebook over and over again chose to optimize for its own interests, like making more money. That's surprising to many people. I don't think it should be that surprising. I saw that at a systemic level, trying to integrate ESG into the world's largest pool of investment assets. It is that if you have a system where people are bound by fiduciary duty to focus on value, right, on dollar value, and you combine that with a market failure. So, for example, it's clearly cheaper to burn fossil fuels than we need for it to be as a society, because we still are not penalizing the negative externality. In other words, taxing the cost of the pollution being created. You end up with a system that is always going to provide more capital to things that we don't need. And it's never going to allow us to get where we need to go at the speed that we need to go. As a result, Nobel Prize winning economists have been saying for decades that we need a price on carbon. And the reality is the system today, particularly Western capitalism, is very, very short-term oriented, right? The average CEO pays 320 times the industry worker. That's the highest it's been in decades. The average CEO tenure is 5 years. That's the shortest it's been in decades. If you pay CEOs enough that they can make in 5 years what they used to make in 10 or 15, it shouldn't be a surprise that they're not that focused on long-term sustainability issues. And the system with incentives like that tends to optimize to protect its profit as much as it can, including marketing that you don't need to change the rules. And we've seen that before with the tobacco company in the 50s, where they tried to muddy the waters on the links to cancer. We've seen that with the fossil fuel players in recent decades. And now I would argue we're seeing that overall with the entire private sector, particularly big business, and really emanating from the US, where I think a lot of these narratives are made and manufactured and exported. And that is, the idea of stakeholder capitalism that the Business Roundtable has pushed. It's the idea that ESG, that my old firm has pushed a lot of, that ESG is somehow an answer that creates impact. And the reality is it doesn't. And the research that I did over the last year showed that not only does it not create impact, but it tends to mislead the public into believing that we don't need government action. So all of what our experts are telling us on climate change, which is that we need, government reform, actually the case for that gets reduced the more you have, business leaders using billions of dollars of marketing to say we don't need government action, which it kind of, if you go to the sports analogy, imagine the players don't want referees to come and do their jobs, and they spend billions of dollars marketing that good sportsmanship is the answer. And so I'd wrap up by saying a few things. Number one, I think that things are going to have to change, right? It's very clear that this doesn't work. In the last 5 years, seen an increase in ESG assets and ESG talk and, data and tools and standards, all of which can be useful if they're used correctly in the right way, but they're not being, because you can see very clearly that those are all rising alongside carbon emissions and inequality. And most millennials today, and by the way, the oldest millennials are turning 40, so it's not like they're young anymore. The average millennial doesn't believe in capitalism, right? Most of them don't believe in it. Anyone who caught Greta Thunberg's speech last week, the blah, blah, blah speech, has seen that Gen Z seems to be even more cynical, because all they think that they're seeing are words and no action. So I think, number one, it's going to have to change soon. Number two, the evidence is that ESG debate way it's being done today not only doesn't have impact, but it's actually slowing the political foundation for government reform and for following what our experts are telling us. And I'd say the final and third thing is that COVID-19 really makes all of this hard to deny. Right. With COVID-19, we found that it was a systemic curve that we all contribute to and affects all of us. And science told us we needed to flatten the curve as fast as we could. Because the incubation period was a few weeks, people realized that we can't leave it to the free market. So we said, use the government, right? Close the schools, close the bars, make masks mandatory indoors, a whole set of things that built off what the virologists told us on how it spreads to the human behavior aspect of how do you actually flatten the curve when you're talking about human beings. With climate change, the scientists, it's the same thing. It's a systemic curve that we all contribute to and affects all of us. And science telling us we have to flatten it. It's greenhouse gas emissions. But because the incubation period is decades, what we're seeing is that actually today, the scientists have been very clear. The first part, they've said we need to flatten the curve. But the second group of experts, economists, who are saying it's going to cost us money to do it, right? One estimates that it'll cost $10 trillion in business profits, because let's face it, climate change is not a blessing, right? We've built an energy system around fossil fuels. It's going to cost money to change that. And I think that second part is where the bill comes and gets paid. And there's a lot of resistance from business around the idea that taxes and regulation are the answer, even if that's what the experts are saying, because we've been largely beholden since the 1980s to a set of theses that say that free markets solve all problems. So final point I'd say is that ESG 2.0 is going to have to come. I think it's going to have to be two things. First of all, much more honest about what creates impact and what doesn't. Long-term climate tech vehicles, climate VC funds that invest in primary funding and, for innovators creating solutions to the climate crisis, those have impact, right? That wouldn't have otherwise occurred. The vast majority of what's being called ESG, which is just, ETFs that hoover up different baskets of shares in the public markets, don't. I think the second thing is that we need to be a lot more honest about what can be done without government action, right? I mean, at some point, even in a soccer game, when people are fouling and kicking people, you turn to each other and say, where are the referees? We need the referees. And I think their experts have been telling us that for decades. And it's sooner than later, I think the business community needs to turn and say, we can't solve these problems without government regulations and change the underlying incentives to the system.
All right, thanks, Tariq. And you shared, it is a worrying thought, but the optimist in me, I guess, still hopes that ESG 2.0, as you mentioned it, will lead to greater outcomes. One of the things I wanted to just maybe touch on, and maybe we'll start with Rohaya here, is that the point about how the different starting points of countries, right? And we talked about this, Tariq, earlier. How developing countries are being asked to comply with standards that are probably being set by more developed markets and specifically countries that have been emitting greenhouse gases for many, many years. So maybe Rohaya, we talked about this in IIC about how standards should be tailored to the context that companies operate in. Maybe you'd like to touch on your views on that.
Yeah. Okay. I think I do agree at the moment, because there are two different markets, developed market, emerging market. And of course, developed market, has gone through this the longest time and they've advanced. in terms of their ESG standards and best practices. But I think for developing world, particularly in Malaysia, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think you're right. Every one of us in institution in Malaysia is at a different pace today. So probably EPF is leading today. There's some institution is just starting to understand the awareness of ESG. So hence, I think there's a lot more collaboration among us to just put us in the same page. So I think active engagement again needs to happen among institutions, as well as even now creating some baseline standards that we feel is reasonable to start. So I think, as you know, that this is one of the Pokupoh initiative by government to standardize reporting among the GLICs, and have some kind of a baseline assessment across. So I think this is a good effort, and we should welcome that.
Tariq, maybe you'd like to comment. I mean, you've been on the other side of the fence with BlackRock and investing in mostly developed markets. But do you think it's fair that some of the developing countries have been asked to comply with the standards set by those who are a bit more advanced in terms of ahead in the development curve?
No, I mean, I don't think it's fair. I'd say, quite honestly, I think that one of the underlying challenges is that in many cases, developed countries have emitted greenhouse gases in large quantities to industrialize over centuries or decades, and slowest to change their systems, and yet it's often developing countries that are going to bear the brunt of it. And so I think, there are almost two pieces here. I mean, there's what we can do as financial players in it. And I think it's important to look at climate risks, but I don't view that as an impact thing, because that's just, to me, risk management. Because again, climate risks, I think it's interesting that they don't really mitigate climate change. I mean, to give you an example, I remember a friend of mine who lives in Miami believed that climate risks in the financial system as a way to fight climate change. And I remember I had to tell him, I said, listen, this is not about stopping Miami from getting wrecked by climate change. It's about us trying to get our money out before it hits, which is in large part what it is, right? It's really just there's a difference between protecting portfolio and protecting the planet. And so I think for developing countries, they're going to have to protect their portfolios and their, which are more exposed to their societies, who are more exposed to climate change in many cases. And I think the underlying challenge is that above that, at the level of the regulation and government talks and COP26 is really where the fight is going to have to happen. And I think that's where I would argue even developing countries even more should make the argument that neoliberalism as a philosophy needs to be turned on its head, 30, 40 years after the fact and 13 years after the financial crisis. We really need governments to take the lead. Otherwise, very little will get done. And again, developing countries will end up bearing the brunt of it. I mean, there'll be more risks in the system and more risks to your portfolio, more risks to societies, because it truly is inherently unfair. If you look at what's being asked of developing countries and where they're actually, emitting on a per capita basis relative to rich countries.
Okay, I think we've been queued to start taking questions from the floor. So we have the first. Can we have the first question? Okay, so the question is, will the considerations of sustainable ESG investing in a portfolio lead to an underperformance? And how will EPF specifically address this issue with larger contributing population being more dependent on EPF savings in retirement? So Rohaya?
Yeah. So I think let's go back to our mission today. Our mission vision is actually that EPF is here to help members to achieve better future and safeguard members' savings and deliver excellent services. So I think by embedding sustainability in our investment activities is part of our strategy to mitigate risk. At the same time, to create, to drive value creation. So this is a sustainable approach for our members. As I mentioned before, we don't want to end up in terms of getting to stranded assets. So hence, there's a lot of urgency to address this and to ensure to protect our members' savings in the future.
Okay, next question, please. Previously, investors and shareholders demand a certain minimum requirements for their investments. Is that still the case? It seems that nowadays investors, especially institutional investors, are now putting a premium on sustainability factors. So maybe, I don't know, Rohaya and Luanne, you would like to answer that? Or?
So I think again yes, I agree. Today investors are more demanding. We're looking for return plus, as we always say. So I mean, return is still a primary requirement for investors. But of course, now we have to look at ESG component. In terms of their governance standards, their socials. How do you protect social community? Looking at addressing climate change. So there's a lot more things that investors are demanding today.
So Luanne, yeah, maybe from a perspective of CIMB, you have your investors as well as maybe also from a lender's perspective, are you sort of imposing some of these considerations to your customers as well?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a number of sector guides for our credit, and we do require certain things, but at the same time, the credit worthiness of a particular business or a particular person is still, fundamental. And this is where the challenge lies, because many companies that are doing sustainable things, especially, more kind of groundbreaking things, they're newer companies with a shorter track record. And this is where we run into challenges. And this is where we need things like international funding and multilaterals to come in. But I think, as already highlighted, some of this is really slow to happen. And this is what we really need to accelerate for sustainable finance to get moving on a large scale.
Yeah, maybe Dino, maybe I just can add a few more things. Today, we have not seen differentiation in terms of, particularly in terms of funding, those that has got very, very good ESG should get better pricing. So I think we should move towards, more differentiation eventually, so that people can be associated with, good ESG companies or poor ESG companies.
Okay. Can we have the next question? So this is to Tariq. We need critical voices like yours. Thank you. I understand that our fiduciary duties are often driven by dollar value. What are your thoughts on aggressive pricing on ESG or environmental and social costs, or the introduction of natural capital?
I think these are all really interesting ideas. Thank you for the kind words. I'd say, look, I think the most important question around sustainability from a societal perspective, if you just zoom out and forget the financial system, is today whether we believe voluntary compliance or mandatory compliance makes sense. When it's not in people's interest to do something, but it's in the public good overall, the long-term public good, then it has to be mandatory compliance, right? So that's why here in Toronto, for example, they started closing everything when COVID happened, quite aggressive to flatten the curve, as I'm sure they did in Malaysia. And that meant that, they didn't just do things that were, individual. It had to be systemic, right? So everybody, and it wasn't just voluntary, it was mandatory, right? They're fining people, they're forcibly closing bars. I think that the question you ask is important, because the system as it stands is not going to value the natural environment. It's not going to value our most important environmental and social considerations, I think in many cases, unless we force it to, right? So what I saw was that there was this magical idea that purpose and profit overlap. And if that's the case, then companies will do the right thing and we don't, the regulators can go home. The reality is that after decades of not really regulating companies, whether it's the tech ones we're seeing with Facebook now, or it's big box retailers underpaying their workers, the answers are clear. If they're underpaying their workers and 25% of them are on food stamps, then you probably need to increase the minimum wage or tax them more. If they're not, they're polluting, you need a carbon tax. To your question, if they're not valuing natural environment, you need to force them to value it, because within that you have a market-based mechanism that's highly efficient and optimizes for the best outcomes. But it needs to price in those externalities. It needs to price in our natural environment. If we don't do that and we rely on it people to naturally do the right thing, based on ethics statements and stakeholder capitalism. Unfortunately, I wish it were the case, but in reality, it doesn't work. And I think you really do need aggressive pricing of these things.
Okay, can we have the next question, please? Next question. Okay, the critical success factor of ESG is bringing all stakeholders along on the journey. Most efforts thus far revolve around investors and governments. How are firms thinking about bridging the divide with societies, especially in developing markets? Maybe I'll ask Tanah to answer this one.
Thanks for the question, Dato' Fazlur. So I think, look, I'm not gonna reiterate what especially what Tariq just said. For us, we're really in our own little corner, doing our own little thing for, without regulation, without investors pressuring us to do these things. It's going to be completely voluntary and up to our own discretion, right? And even reporting is voluntary as well. So we don't even have to necessarily disclose how we're doing in different environmental and social issues that, are most material to our company. So again, I think without those things, we're very much navigating this by ourselves, and no one's necessarily holding us accountable as private sector. That said, how are we thinking about bridging that divide with the societies and where we operate, right? Especially, for a Gojek or Tokopedia is solely in Indonesia, and Gojek, we're also in Vietnam and Singapore. And so I think for us, it's as best as possible, what is within our control, i.e. what can we roll out across our platform that are economic and credible options for our ecosystem to be able to make those types of behavior changes. I really, really detest shifting responsibility to consumers or to even our merchants who are, by the way, almost like they're over 96% micro SMEs. We're talking about micro SMEs, very much previously part of the informal economy. These are not big enterprises with franchises and so forth. And so for us, it's a very decentralized model. So for us to enforce anything on them, especially when more sustainable options, one, are relatively untested in this market, and two, come with a huge premium for them. It's very difficult to enforce anything or to justify that burden being shifted to, again, either merchants or sellers, but also to consumers. So we are doing our best to try and figure out, because again, as Tariq mentioned, there is no magic holy grail of profit and purpose for us. It definitely comes with a sacrifice. As long as we are able to justify that to our shareholders, and which we are currently doing, I think we can find a way to make this happen. And so for us, it's things like us investing in alternative packaging for our merchants to be able to afford that are on par, if not lesser than the current products available, whether it's styrofoam or plastic packaging, because by the way, that is still ridiculously cheap, as many of you know. It's also providing the right pricing mechanisms and financial models for our drivers to be able to afford electric vehicles, because we have set a target for 100% of our ecosystem to shift to electric vehicles. We are an asset-light company. We don't own any of our offices. We don't own any vehicles. We certainly don't own any of the products that are sold on our platforms. But I think we do have some power in being able to provide and test those economical, credible solutions and alternatives for our merchants, our partners, our driver partners, and our sellers, and eventually consumers too, to make those more sustainable choices. And if it means that we bear that burden, that cost for now, we certainly will, until we get those solutions. Those solutions are more mature in this market, until investors and regulators start, being much more stringent as it relates to the regulatory environment, but also the allocation of capital for companies like ours, so that it's a level playing field. It's not just a Gojek or Tokopedia doing this in our own corner, but rather the entire industry is being, as Tariq mentioned before, refereed to also do the same.
Okay. So I think my key takeaway from what I've heard from both Tanah and Tariq is that, usually there is a conflict of interest sometimes there's conflict of interest between purpose and profit. And I guess it's our job as investors and corporates to sort of create that environment to have that overlap between profit and purpose, so that we can drive towards the right outcomes. So I think that's all the time we have for Q&A. But before we leave, I'd like to invite all the panelists for their own closing remarks. maybe we can start with Luanne. What is the one thing that you want the audience to leave today with?
I would say whatever you are, wherever you are, however much you know or you think you don't know, just start doing something, but don't kid yourself. It is not something that's easy. If we want to make real changes, it's going to be a tough and difficult journey. So don't think that just by, saving, not using one plastic straw, you're going to save the world, because you're not. So start, but be realistic about the deep changes that need to be made.
Thanks. Rohaya?
So ESG risk can be very destroying. So I think time is running out. So calling all board members, companies board, management to start their sustainability commitment and make it real.
Okay, Tanah?
I think for me, it's very much around using our voices as citizens, as consumers, and more importantly, considering this audience as professionals and public sector leaders, really using our agency to be able to hold our own organizations accountable, our own governments accountable to making the types of changes to flatten the curve and treat this very much like the imminent challenge that it is, similar to how we responded collectively, private and public sector, to COVID.
Okay, and finally, Tariq?
I agree with everything my co-panelists just said, and I'd add on top of what Tanah just said that I think that it's important to build off the example of COVID, because we cannot be in a position where our message to younger generations is that we believe in government action aggressively to flatten the curve that's a threat to baby boomer interests, right? I mean, let's face it, COVID-19 was more of a threat to the financial interest and the health of older people. But then when it's something like climate change, which is frankly far more dangerous, but is going to affect Greta Thunberg's generation more than it is, the average 70-year-old. And then say, well, for that one, let's, the incubation period's long and we get paid next few years. So let's just leave that one to the free market when it's clear that that's not the answer. And we have Nobel Prize winners telling us that it's not. And so I think that we're going to go through a significant debate in the next few years. And I think that's a good thing. I wouldn't say that ESG will get thrown out. I'd say that there are tools, data, standards, and people, most importantly, who are great. Those are grown and we can use those. But the narratives and the products are going to need to change, because the narratives can't be that, good sportsmanship alone is the answer, right? We're going to need referees. And the products need to be more honest about what is real impact and what isn't. And, so that we're not just putting a green label on everything to get more assets and fees.
So thank you, Tariq, and thanks again to all our esteemed panelists for sharing your thoughts and with us today. I know we all can play our part in rewriting the narrative on ESG and in business, and hopefully reinvent our world for tomorrow, one that our children and grandchildren will thank us for. With that, I thank you all again. Hope to see you all in person soon. Bye.